You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Decision discipline provides the structure and confidence teams need to act amid uncertainty and differing perspectives. Without it, groups often stall in cycles of debate or succumb to decisions driven by hierarchy rather than evidence. Clear decision-making practices align participants on the problem, the options, and the criteria for choice, ensuring that outcomes are trustworthy and momentum is preserved. This is especially critical in agile environments, where time is constrained and decisions must support iteration without creating paralysis. On the exam, decision discipline scenarios often test whether candidates can balance inclusion, speed, and rigor. The agile response usually emphasizes clear decision rights, structured evaluation, and principled commitment. Discipline does not mean rigidity. It means giving decisions enough rigor to inspire confidence while keeping the process lightweight enough to sustain delivery pace. Decision framing begins with clarifying the problem, constraints, and desired outcomes. This ensures participants evaluate options against the same context rather than bringing mismatched assumptions. For instance, a team deciding on a new testing tool must first align on what problem is being solved: speed, coverage, or integration with pipelines. Constraints, such as budget or security standards, narrow the field of choices, while desired outcomes provide the yardstick for comparison. Without clear framing, debates drift and preferences dominate rather than evidence. On the exam, framing scenarios often test whether candidates can ground decisions in shared understanding. The agile response usually emphasizes starting by defining the question well, ensuring that trade-offs are evaluated against the same baseline. Framing prevents wasted energy by aligning discussions to context and goals from the outset. Decision types distinguish between reversible and consequential, hard-to-reverse choices. Many decisions can be altered easily, and treating them as high stakes wastes time. Conversely, consequential decisions, such as architecture choices, require greater rigor. Amazon popularized this distinction as one-way versus two-way doors. One-way decisions are difficult to reverse and demand thorough evaluation, while two-way decisions can be tested quickly. For example, experimenting with a new meeting format is reversible, while selecting a database platform is not. On the exam, decision-type scenarios often test whether candidates understand how rigor should match the cost of being wrong. The agile response usually emphasizes applying lightweight processes to reversible choices and deeper analysis to consequential ones. This distinction preserves speed while ensuring important commitments are made responsibly. Decision rights matrices clarify who has ownership of different parts of the process. These matrices typically specify who proposes, who must be consulted, who approves, and who executes. For example, a product owner may propose backlog priorities, engineering leads may be consulted for feasibility, stakeholders may approve scope trade-offs, and developers execute. Without such clarity, teams waste time debating legitimacy or revisiting choices. Decision rights reduce ambiguity and build trust by making ownership explicit. On the exam, decision rights scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between inclusive consultation and decisive authority. The agile response usually emphasizes transparency and roles to avoid confusion. Clear matrices empower teams to act confidently, knowing who holds accountability at each stage of the decision. Option generation ensures that teams consider multiple viable paths before converging. Prematurely anchoring on the first plausible idea creates tunnel vision and misses creative alternatives. Generating options requires deliberate effort, such as structured brainstorming or design studios. For example, when planning a release, a team might first generate 3 sequencing options rather than defaulting to the one that appears most obvious. This breadth reduces the risk of missing better solutions. On the exam, option generation scenarios often test whether candidates recognize the danger of converging too quickly. The agile response usually emphasizes exploring multiple ideas before narrowing. Option generation keeps teams from being trapped by early bias, opening the door to innovative, higher-value decisions. Criteria and trade-off analysis provide the lens for comparing options systematically. By evaluating each choice against value, risk, cost, and time, teams expose where preferences diverge and where data could resolve disagreement. For instance, two designs may appear equivalent until one shows significantly higher support costs, making trade-offs clear. Visual tools such as weighted scoring matrices or decision grids support transparency. Without explicit criteria, decisions become opinion contests. On the exam, trade-off scenarios often test whether candidates can ground choices in structured comparison. The agile response usually emphasizes evaluating decisions against shared success criteria. Trade-off analysis creates clarity, not consensus by default, enabling teams to commit confidently even when not everyone initially agrees. Risk appetite and guardrails articulate the level of uncertainty a team is willing to accept and the non-negotiables it must respect. These boundaries improve both safety and speed by clarifying what is off-limits. For example, a team may accept experimenting with new user interface flows, but set guardrails that no customer data is exposed without encryption. Guardrails allow teams to innovate within safe limits while avoiding constant escalation. On the exam, risk appetite scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between acceptable experimentation and prohibited risk. The agile response usually emphasizes balancing exploration with responsibility. Guardrails empower teams to act decisively while ensuring safety, compliance, and ethics are preserved. Evidence standards define what constitutes good enough information to make a decision at this point in time. They help teams avoid both hasty guesses and endless analysis. For example, before selecting a new deployment tool, the team might agree that 2 pilot results and a cost comparison are sufficient, rather than waiting for exhaustive case studies. Evidence standards bring discipline to ambiguous debates by setting thresholds. On the exam, evidence standard scenarios often test whether candidates can balance rigor with momentum. The agile response usually emphasizes sufficiency, not perfection. Decisions should be informed enough to proceed responsibly without delaying delivery indefinitely. Standards ensure that progress is not sacrificed at the altar of certainty. Timeboxing and decision cadence protect momentum by setting deadlines proportionate to the impact of the decision. A reversible choice may be timeboxed to a single meeting, while a consequential one may warrant a week of evaluation. Cadence ensures recurring decisions, such as backlog prioritization, happen predictably, reducing ad hoc churn. For example, joint triage every 2 weeks ensures dependencies are resolved regularly. Without timeboxing, discussions expand indefinitely. Without cadence, decisions are made reactively. On the exam, cadence scenarios often test whether candidates understand the need to balance speed and deliberation. The agile response usually emphasizes proportionate deadlines and regular rhythms. Timeboxing and cadence sustain delivery pace while ensuring decisions are made thoughtfully. Facilitation practices manage the heat of disagreement without suppressing dissent. Skilled facilitators create space for all voices, guide debate toward evidence, and converge on decisions without coercion. Techniques such as round-robin speaking or anonymous voting balance participation. For example, if engineers and stakeholders clash over priorities, a facilitator may reframe the debate in terms of shared outcomes. Without facilitation, conflict either escalates or goes underground, undermining unity. On the exam, facilitation scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize the need for neutral process leadership. The agile response usually emphasizes facilitation that protects candor while guiding convergence. Facilitation ensures that disagreement strengthens decisions rather than paralyzing the team. Bias mitigation techniques reduce the distortions of overconfidence, groupthink, or anchoring. Methods such as pre-mortems, imagining failure and working backward, red team challenges, having a subgroup argue against the favored option, and independent estimates Collecting input separately before group discussion broaden perspective. For example, before launching a new feature, a pre-mortem may reveal overlooked dependencies. These techniques slow the rush to consensus and surface risks that enthusiasm hides. On the exam, bias mitigation scenarios often test whether candidates understand how to improve decision quality. The agile response usually emphasizes that discipline includes checking biases. Decisions are stronger when teams deliberately challenge assumptions and expose blind spots. Decision records preserve context and rationale for future reference, capturing the problem statement, options considered, rationale for choice, and expected signals ensures accountability and learning. For example, documenting why a team chose one vendor over another prevents second-guessing later and provides evidence for audits. Without records, decisions are forgotten or misunderstood, leading to unnecessary reversals. On the exam, documentation scenarios often test whether candidates can balance lightweight record-keeping with traceability. The agile response usually emphasizes brief but structured records that remain accessible. Decision discipline extends beyond the moment of choice. It ensures traceability for learning and compliance over time. Alignment communication translates decisions into clear guidance on who does what by when. Even a sound decision fails if execution drifts due to vague instructions. For example, after selecting a new testing framework, alignment communication specifies which team configures it, when it must be live, and what success signals are expected. Without this, intent and action diverge. On the exam, alignment scenarios often test whether candidates recognize the gap between decision and execution. The agile response usually emphasizes clarity and specificity in communicating outcomes. Decision quality is measured not by intent but by consistent follow-through, and alignment communication is the bridge between choice and action. Disagree and commit norms preserve unity after a decision is taken. Teams need not achieve unanimity, but once a choice is made, all members support it in action. This prevents private dissent from undermining execution. For example, even if one subgroup favored an alternative vendor, once the decision is made, they commit to supporting integration with the chosen partner. Disagree and commit creates psychological safety to voice dissent, but responsibility to move forward together. On the exam, commitment norm scenarios often test whether candidates understand how teams preserve unity without forcing consensus. The agile response usually emphasizes commitment as a principle of professionalism and trust. Disagree and commit balances diversity of views with collective accountability. Exception and revisit criteria prevent both rigidity and churn. By specifying what evidence or events justify reopening a decision, teams avoid revisiting choices endlessly while preserving flexibility. For example, a team may agree that a vendor decision will only be revisited if defect rates exceed a certain threshold. Without such criteria, teams waste time relitigating decisions without new evidence. On the exam, revisit scenarios often test whether candidates understand how to balance stability and adaptability. The agile response usually emphasizes clear triggers. Exception criteria anchor decisions in evidence, ensuring that change is responsible rather than reactionary. Teams maintain momentum while preserving the option to pivot when reality changes significantly. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Commitment mechanisms ensure that decisions move from intent into visible, trackable action. Without translation into concrete work, even well-reasoned decisions remain abstract. Mechanisms include adding backlog items, setting milestones, and assigning owners. For example, if a team decides to adopt a new test framework, backlog items may cover setup, training, and integration. Visible artifacts make it clear who is responsible and when outcomes are expected. This visibility reinforces accountability and prevents decisions from fading once discussions end. On the exam, Commitment mechanism scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between verbal agreement and structured follow-through. The agile response usually emphasizes embedding decisions into delivery systems so intent becomes execution. Effective discipline converts talk into action, ensuring that commitments create real momentum rather than aspirational statements. Leading indicators and checkpoints help teams validate decisions before it is too late to pivot. By defining early signals of success or failure, teams reduce risk and increase adaptability. For example, if a decision to trial a new deployment tool includes a checkpoint after 2 sprints measuring deployment frequency, the team can course-correct quickly if assumptions fail. These indicators serve as feedback loops, turning decisions into hypotheses subject to evidence. Without them, teams risk discovering flaws only after large investments. On the exam, checkpoint scenarios often test whether candidates can design early feedback mechanisms. The agile response usually emphasizes that discipline includes monitoring as well as deciding. Indicators protect teams from blind commitment, enabling responsible adjustment before consequences escalate. Safe-to-test pilots and slices operationalize contentious choices by reducing their scope. Rather than committing to full-scale rollout, teams validate assumptions through limited trials. For example, instead of migrating all services to a new cloud provider immediately, a team might migrate one low-risk application to test performance and integration. These slices reduce exposure and provide data for broader rollout. Safe-to-test practices combine agility's emphasis on experimentation with decision discipline's need for commitment. On the exam, pilot scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize how to de-risk major decisions. The agile response usually emphasizes piloting as a way to balance speed with safety. Trials demonstrate intent while keeping reversibility and learning at the forefront. Escalation pathways clarify when decisions require broader authority. Teams operate with autonomy, but some decisions exceed local guardrails, such as those affecting budgets, compliance, or organizational strategy. Pathways ensure that issues escalate rapidly rather than stalling. For instance, if 2 teams cannot agree on a shared dependency, escalation to a product council may be necessary. Without defined pathways, unresolved disputes waste time and damage relationships. On the exam, escalation path scenarios often test whether candidates can separate team-level ownership from systemic authority. The agile response usually emphasizes that clear, rapid escalation enables autonomy to coexist with accountability. Pathways keep teams moving by preventing stalemates while preserving decision-making responsibility at the lowest reasonable level. Cross-team decision forums address shared dependencies and prevent downstream thrash. Forums bring representatives together to resolve conflicts and integrate perspectives across teams. For example, multiple product squads working on related services may use a portfolio sync to decide on shared API standards. Without integration forums, inconsistent choices fragment delivery, leading to rework and user dissatisfaction. These forums must remain lightweight and outcome-driven, not bureaucratic. On the exam, forum scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize the value of integrated decision-making. The agile response usually emphasizes balancing autonomy with shared alignment. Forums reduce silos by providing space for interdependent decisions, ensuring that choices scale beyond individual teams to serve collective outcomes. Remote decision practices adapt discipline to distributed environments. Techniques such as pre-reads, asynchronous comments, and concise live sessions allow decisions to remain inclusive and efficient across time zones. For example, pre-reading documents before a meeting ensures discussion time is used for trade-offs, not information sharing. Async input allows broader participation without forcing late-night calls. Without these practices, distributed teams face delays or exclusion. On the exam, remote scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize adaptations for inclusivity. The agile response usually emphasizes intentional design of remote decision practices. Distributed teams thrive when decision discipline respects geography and time constraints while sustaining speed and fairness. Conflict resolution agreements protect relationships during high-stakes choices. By separating interests from positions, teams uncover shared outcomes behind disagreements. For example, design and engineering may argue over implementation details but agree on the shared goal of improving user experience. Facilitated negotiation and reframing shift debates from adversarial to collaborative. Without these practices, decisions can scar relationships, undermining future collaboration. On the exam, resolution scenarios often test whether candidates can see conflict as opportunity rather than dysfunction. The agile response usually emphasizes structured conflict handling. Decision discipline is not only about outcomes, but also about preserving the trust needed for future decisions. Teams that resolve conflict constructively emerge stronger and more cohesive. Accountability rhythms ensure decisions are revisited not for debate but for execution checks. By regularly reviewing commitments, progress, and blockers, teams reinforce that decisions are hypotheses to execute, not declarations to file. For example, reviewing decision outcomes in retrospectives connects discipline to continuous improvement. Without accountability rhythms, decisions drift or lose credibility. On the exam, rhythm scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between healthy review and endless revisiting. The agile response usually emphasizes that accountability means execution and learning, not relitigation. Regular rhythms make decisions living artifacts, ensuring they drive outcomes rather than gather dust in documentation. Reversal protocols define how to unwind decisions when evidence shows they are failing. These protocols include communication strategies, rollback steps, and learning capture. For example, if a pilot integration introduces unacceptable latency, a reversal plan ensures rollback is quick and disruption minimal. Without clear protocols, reversals become chaotic or politically fraught, discouraging teams from admitting mistakes. On the exam, reversal scenarios often test whether candidates understand that discipline includes graceful exits. The agile response usually emphasizes planning reversals as part of commitment. By normalizing reversibility, teams gain courage to experiment while retaining safety. Protocols protect flow and credibility, showing that course correction is a strength, not a weakness. Documentation hygiene ensures that decisions remain accessible, traceable, and useful. By linking decisions to tickets, code, or design artifacts, teams preserve context for future reference. For example, storing rationale for choosing a specific API contract prevents rework years later when new teams revisit the question. Hygiene means keeping records searchable and concise, avoiding the trap of excessive bureaucracy. On the exam, documentation scenarios often test whether candidates can balance traceability with agility. The agile response usually emphasizes disciplined, lightweight record-keeping. Decision hygiene prevents loss of knowledge and ensures that future teams can learn from past reasoning rather than repeating debates unnecessarily. Metrics for decision quality evaluate whether decision practices deliver real value. Indicators such as cycle time to decision, rework due to reversals, and impact achieved versus expected reveal strengths and weaknesses. For example, if decisions take months without improving outcomes, processes may be too heavy. Conversely, if reversals spike, teams may need better evidence standards. Metrics ensure continuous improvement in decision-making itself. On the exam, metric scenarios often test whether candidates can connect decision discipline to measurable outcomes. The agile response usually emphasizes tracking both speed and quality. Metrics keep decision practices adaptive, ensuring they evolve alongside the team's context and maturity. Anti-patterns erode decision discipline if left unchecked. Shadow decisions occur when informal choices override official ones, undermining trust. Endless revisiting without new evidence wastes time and stalls execution. Private dissent that surfaces only after implementation sabotages commitment. Each of these patterns creates churn and resentment. For example, a team may appear to agree in meetings but quietly undermine execution afterward. On the exam, anti-pattern scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize dysfunctional decision behaviors. The agile response usually emphasizes transparency and accountability. Anti-patterns must be surfaced and corrected quickly to preserve momentum and trust. Discipline thrives when decisions are respected, executed, and revisited only when evidence warrants. Leadership modeling sets the tone for decision culture. When leaders make reasoning explicit, own trade-offs, and demonstrate willingness to commit under uncertainty, teams follow suit. For example, a leader might acknowledge the risks of choosing a vendor but explain the rationale and commit to course correction if signals shift. Without modeling, teams may fear committing or hide behind endless analysis. On the exam, leadership scenarios often test whether candidates understand the cultural role of leaders. The agile response usually emphasizes transparency, courage, and adaptability. Leaders show that discipline is not about perfection but about principled commitment, paired with willingness to learn. Modeling creates trust in both the process and its outcomes. Continuous refinement of decision practices ensures they evolve with the team's maturity and context. Early teams may rely on structured templates, while experienced ones may use lighter methods. Guardrails, cadences, and facilitation techniques should be revisited as conditions change. For example, a distributed team may adopt async practices as it grows geographically. Without refinement, decision processes either ossify into bureaucracy or degrade into chaos. On the exam, refinement scenarios often test whether candidates can adapt practices. The agile response usually emphasizes tailoring discipline continuously. Decision-making, like delivery, is an iterative process. Teams that refine their practices avoid stagnation and sustain both momentum and quality over time. In conclusion, decision discipline transforms disagreement into momentum by pairing clarity of rights with structured evaluation and principled commitment. Commitment mechanisms, evidence standards, and safe-to-test slices ensure decisions move from talk to action while remaining adaptable. Escalation pathways, forums, and conflict agreements preserve collaboration across teams. Documentation, metrics, and accountability rhythms sustain transparency and improvement. Leadership modeling and refinement reinforce trust and adaptability, ensuring discipline evolves as teams mature. On the exam, candidates will be tested on their ability to connect decision practices to outcomes. In practice, decision discipline is what enables teams to act decisively, support commitments, and adapt responsibly in the face of uncertainty. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.